Hi, I'm Sonia Schaefer with Simply Charlotte Mason, and this is my friend, Rochelle Baborina. I've enjoyed learning about Charlotte Mason's methods over the years through her original writings. But one subject she doesn't touch on very much in her original writings, and that is the subject of mathematics. In fact, often when I would read in Volume 3, when Charlotte said, "I need not touch upon the subject of mathematics. It is receiving ample attention and is rapidly becoming an instrument for living teaching in our schools," I would think, yes, you do need to touch upon this subject. Tell me more. I need more of this, and I want to know how to make it an instrument for living teaching in my school. Well, I was thrilled to find out when Rochelle started researching Charlotte Mason's approach to math and teaching math. I started reading her blog and finding out all about the things that she was discovering. So, Rochelle, I would like you to share with us what brought you to the point of researching about Charlotte Mason's method of teaching math.
Right. I was homeschooling my two boys when I realized that my oldest son was what Charlotte called a good arithmetician. He could apply the rules, but he couldn't see the reason behind them. But I think even more disturbing was the fact that he was getting high marks on his worksheets and his exams, but math had gone from his most loved subject to his most hated subject. And it was at about the same time that we were reading Heidi as our bedtime read out loud.
Yes.
And I remembered that Charlotte had called mathematics a mountainous land, and it was every bit as vigorous and health-giving to the student as the Swiss Alps were to our little Swiss heroine Heidi. So at that point, I set out to discover just exactly what was this living teaching of math that she had mentioned.
And where did you go to find all of this, since it wasn't in her original writings? Where did you find it?
Well, first, of course, I combed through her writings,
Yes.
and there isn't a lot. I went to the Parents' Review articles, but then I actually started finding and just scouring libraries and archives for every single book that she had ever mentioned and used, and then I went through page by page according to her schedules to find out what was taught, when it was taught, and actually it was quite revealing because that showed how it was taught, even by looking at her scope and sequence.
And the results of all that research are in your book, Mathematics, an Instrument for Living Teaching. It gives the scope and sequence and the results of all of this information that Rochelle was able to discover.
An enlightening point in my research was when I uncovered the actual pamphlet that Irene Stevens, who was a guest lecturer in mathematics at Ambleside in 1911, had written. And this pamphlet was the handbook for teachers and parents alike to teach their children elementary arithmetic.
So this is the one that Charlotte recommended her teachers and her parents in the schooling used.
It did, and what happens is in Volume 1, Charlotte mentions Sonnenschein's ABC for Arithmetic.
Yes.
And so people will go out and they will find that, a reproduction of that, and they will try to teach their child using that book. But what I discovered was that within a few years of using this book, they actually stopped using the book, because it wasn't giving them the living teaching that followed the rest of Charlotte's principles. So what Irene Stevens did was she set out step by step to show the parents how to do this.
Wow. So what stood out to you from all that research?
What really stood out to me was just how simple, effective, and enjoyable the teaching of arithmetic could be. And anyone can teach their child elementary arithmetic without the use of an expensive curriculum or manipulatives, or without it being overburdening or taxing to mother.
I see. I remember you talking about when you were teaching your son that you would just grab your book and open it to whatever page, whatever skill you were teaching next, and use it as a guide instead of an actual curriculum. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's a chapter on elementary arithmetic in the book, and we have a set of scope and sequence all laid out for you already. And so we would have our manipulatives, things found in our own home, and I would simply open the page, say we were doing long division today. I would open the page to long division, give it a quick review so I knew what I was what I was going to be doing for the day, and then begin with my child.
One thing I love about Charlotte's methods is that she used the same philosophy over all the subjects, and so many of her methods support that philosophy and undergird it. So let's talk about education is an atmosphere, a discipline, a life. Let's talk about how that fits with the teaching of math. First, education is an atmosphere. How does math fit into that?
Well, we know that before the age of 6, a child's education is really based on their environment, their natural home atmosphere, and the simple games that they play normally
Yes.
as a child.
Yes, they don't have to have the formal lessons at that point. They're just
Right.
kind of discovering. I remember Charlotte talking about no special preparation was needed for mathematics during the early years. Now, it seems like we would do, learn to count, or at least some of these informal activities in the atmosphere. So what did she mean about special preparation? What should we avoid?
Okay. Well, I think one thing that we have today that can kind of get moms like thinking I must do more before my child is 6 is when your neighbor says that her daughter is already learning pre-algebra in kindergarten.
Yeah.
So we really
Yes.
have to be careful not to do that, because what Charlotte she considered it not only undesirable to begin these math lessons early, but they could actually be detrimental, because what it would do is it would stifle the child. They would become bored with the subject before it even began, when really in our daily life, whether we're setting the table or we're walking to the park and we're watching the sun's movements, these things are all happening naturally.
Yes. So when they're old enough to start the formal lessons at age 6, right? How does atmosphere carry on from there?
Well, when we begin formal lessons with our child at 6, the teaching is going to be simple, humble, and direct. We're not going to overteach. We're also not going to line our bookshelves with geometric figures or stitch geometric figures onto cards, hoping that this geometric form is going to somehow instill mathematics into our child. It's also not going to be overly sweetened with endless math games, and it's not going to be watered down with the types of books where you're counting fairies or frogs.
So you talked about not overly sweetening it with all these games and things. That reminds me of habits, that everything we do does set up a habit of some kind with our children. And that brings us to education is a discipline, the discipline of good habit. Charlotte talked a lot about the connection between how we teach math and habit training.
Yeah.
So what are some of the ways that the teaching of math and the cultivation of good habits are connected?
Well, through Charlotte's living teaching, what we're actually doing is we are going to help nurture these habits that are very important, the habits of accuracy, right? The habit of neatness by the way we teach a child to write their figures.
Yes.
The habit of attention, because we're going to give them an oral, engaging question, but we're only going to say it once, so they're going to be paying attention. And because it's something that relates to their life, they're going to actually be using the habit of imagining. Right? And then we're going to be using mental math at the end of every lesson. And what that's going to do is really get them to think quickly and clearly.
Oh, yes, she talked about that. Now, there is one quote in one of her books that I think strikes fear in most mothers' hearts. That is in book 1. Let me read the quote so we know for sure. She says, "There is no one subject in which good teaching affects more, as there is none in which slovenly teaching has more mischievous results," speaking of math. This is a scary quote.
Yes.
It makes you think, if I'm not good in math, I can't teach my children. Yet this ties into discipline of habits, doesn't it?
It does. So this quote, and as a matter of fact, I had the same experience. I think I ran across this quote because we see it a lot
We do.
in the internet sphere.
Yes.
And it had been taken out of context by a well-meaning blogger, and I read it as a mother of young children and thought, I have no business teaching my child
Exactly.
math.
Exactly.
And it wasn't until I went back and I read it in context, right, to see that what Charlotte was doing was talking about the discipline of good habits. And in this case, she's talking about the discipline of the teacher or the mother, right? So we don't prod our child along.
Yes.
We don't give them crutches to go on. It's in their own power they have to go. We don't allow that same sloppy work.
Yes.
We also want to make sure that they are paying attention, and we aren't giving them the answers. We don't want our child just to do math, right?
Yes.
We want them to actually understand and gain a real mathematical thinking.
That is such a temptation for moms to do is, well, I'm going to help them so they can finish this page.
Yes.
And whatever it takes, to prod them along and give them hints just so we can complete the work,
Right.
rather than do they really understand it? That makes sense when it's taken in the context of habits of the mother. Now let's talk about one other aspect of education is an atmosphere, a discipline, a life. We talk about, you call your book that mathematics is an instrument for living teaching, and Charlotte said it's becoming an instrument of living teaching in our schools. How is the teaching of math related to living ideas, to life?
Okay. Well, these vital ideas are really what I think draws a lot of people to a Charlotte Mason education. And we aren't used to thinking that there are actual ideas found in math from the very
Yes.
beginning, from the time a child learns the stroke for one. The idea that there is a symbol that stands for a quantity is what they're meeting, and we don't want to stand between that. Another thing is this living teaching. It's not a teaching that drowns the subject in verbiage, as Charlotte calls it, where we're over-teaching the subject. And as a matter of fact, even in some of the books that Charlotte used, they begin, and the same thing with our curriculum today, it begins the new concept with laying out exactly what the concept is and giving all of the rules. Well, Charlotte's teachers would have skipped that page, would have allowed the child to investigate on their own through your guidance.
Yes, guided investigation, yes.
And then the child would be led to discover the rule for himself. And it was only then at the end of the concept where you might go back and actually see it stated.
Which is so similar to how she taught reading, how she
Yes.
taught grammar, how she taught foreign language. It's all just so connected. It's wonderful. Now, when you mentioned the books, I remembered this one, Number Stories of Long Ago. And this is a living, what we would consider a living
Yes.
book. Did Charlotte teach math through living books?
Well, it's a common misconception that math was taught through what we think of living books today.
Stories.
Or that it was taught through a storyline curriculum. That wasn't the case in the Charlotte Mason education. What Charlotte believed was that mathematics was an actual living language itself.
Yes.
That it was both at once melodious and logical, and because of that, it fell outside of her rule for a literary presentation. So we do have this one book that was a free read between our grades 4 through 9. And it really is, this is in the public domain, so you can read it online.
But the
for
children
free.
would just read it in their leisure time. It was
Yes.
not part of the lessons. Charlotte did not use living stories like this and hope the children would grasp concepts of math. It was a totally different way of teaching.
It was, because the math that they're learning, that's full of the living ideas.
Yes.
And so when we allow that kind of unfolding of absolute truth to take place in front of a child's eyes, and we don't stand between that by giving them twaddle, basically, in math form, just because it's a living math book on a list on the internet doesn't actually make it a living math book.
That's true.
It has to stand up to the same qualities that we would look at if we're looking at any other living book. All right? So we don't stand between the child. We allow the math basically to speak for itself.
And you mentioned the absolute truth of the math. That phrase really stood out to me when I was reading your book, that Charlotte appreciated math because of the beauty and truth of math. Talk a little bit about that. What did she mean?
So from the first time I opened Charlotte Mason's volumes, I was highlighting those words, beauty and truth, in relationship to math. Those are words that had never occurred to me to apply to math.
Exactly. When I think back on the math and how I learned math, I don't think beauty and truth.
No, I think tears and frustration was our experience, right? But what's happening here with Charlotte Mason's living teaching is that from the time a child sees 2 plus 2 equals 4 and will never ever equal anything else, no matter what they do, they are actually seeing one of God's laws, one of his fixed laws of the universe in one of its simplest forms.
Yes. Now, talking about Charlotte's philosophy and her methods is so helpful. I've enjoyed reading your blog. Reading your book has been such a help. We thought it might also be helpful to show you some hands-on demonstrations and have Rochelle actually demonstrate for you how Charlotte taught early arithmetic. It's all written out in the book, but we thought it might be helpful for you to see it in action. So that's what we're going to accomplish over these next few demonstrations for you. We hope you'll enjoy it.